Welcome to the 2025 Silber-Obrecht Lectures, presented by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland. I am Heather Miller Rubens, the Executive Director of ICJS, as well as the Roman Catholic scholar. The Silber-Obrecht Lecture is a series of endowed academic lectures intended to advance the emerging field of interreligious and interfaith studies. The development of this field is an indication of the growing understanding in societies as well as among scholars that there are many possible responses to the realities of religious diversity: theological, philosophical, historical, scriptural, ethical, legal, praxeological, and institutional, and that these responses to religious pluralism need thoughtful and reasoned inquiry. The lecture series is named in honor of Sidney and Jean Silber and Charles and Peggy Obrecht, in recognition of their longtime commitment to improving interreligious relationships and understanding. Our 2025 Silber-Obrecht lecturer is Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, the Herman E. Schallman Professor of Jewish Studies and Senior Faculty Fellow, the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary. Rabbi Dr. Mikva will offer a lecture entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be Human? Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Perspectives." Her lecture will be divided into two parts, and this video will cover part one. Part two will be covered in a separate video. A response offered by Dr. Yunus Mirza, founding director of the Berzinji Institute for Global Virtual Learning at Shenandoah University, can be found in a third video. All three videos are available on the ICJS website. A volume based on these lectures will be published by Georgetown University Press as part of the Silber-Obrecht Lecture Series. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva.
I'm deeply honored to be giving these lectures, and I'm grateful to the Silber and Obrecht families for their commitment to interreligious learning, not just learning about, but learning with people of diverse spiritual life stances. And I want to thank the ICJS staff for their exceptional generosity in their spirit and their time and their wisdom as they accompanied me on this journey. So, what's special about human beings? The psalmist asks this question: what is humanity that you are mindful of them? Wondering, why would God give us power over the immense majesty of creation? Qur'an describes objections from the angels when God announces that humans will be Khalifa, viceroy on the earth. They are concerned about our propensity for corruption and violence, and they have a point. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have a lot to say about what it means to be human. Now, you may think that theological anthropology isn't your usual dinner table conversation, but in fact, we talk about it all the time. We're often arguing about it, especially when an idea comes along that challenges our sense of who we are. Often, the culprit has been scientific discovery or technological development. Copernicus and Galileo, they demonstrated that humans aren't the center of the universe, at least not in the way reflected in the structure of the cosmos. The Earth revolves around the sun, and we live in one of countless solar systems in the galaxy. Darwin theorized, and further study has affirmed, that we are the product of evolution, sharing a common ancestor with other primates. Genetics has established that we share at least 98% of our DNA with a chimpanzee, and probably around 50% with a banana. Studies of animals prove that certain species do almost everything we thought was unique to humans. Crows make tools. Dolphins give their children names. Songbirds create distinct cultures. Macaques teach each other based on experience. With combined insight from psychology, neuroscience, and other fields, we've also learned that the operation of the human mind and body look increasingly like a biological machine. Love and awe and even consciousness itself are chemical reactions. And as a thinking machine, we're not all that extraordinary. Generative AI uses large language models, right, to synthesize huge amounts of information. And then it enables them to write or to illustrate better than, and certainly faster than, most humans. There are also physicists who advance the idea of superdeterminism. The entire future of the universe was predetermined at the moment of the Big Bang, making free will logically incoherent nonsense. Now, these findings have not been easily digested. Galileo's book on heliocentrism was banned, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He avoided execution only by claiming that he was simply presenting an argument, but wasn't personally persuaded by the evidence. And I think we've come to terms with that one. But a Gallup poll from last May reported that 37% of Americans still believe that God created human beings in their present form. We did not evolve. Over a third, despite the fact that we teach evolution in schools, and even though another choice was evolution with God's guiding hand, which had another third of respondents. So even those among us who embrace scientific learning, including evolution, don't much like the idea that our free will is compromised by a potent mix of genetic, cultural, and chemical inputs, or quantum physics. Most of us still feel in our gut that there is something special about human beings, even though we simultaneously recognize the perils of this self-aggrandizing instinct, particularly in this Anthropocene age. But one thing about us is that we ask the question. Jürgen Moltmann noted, a cow is always simply a cow. It does not ask, what is a cow? Who am I? Only humans ask such questions, and indeed clearly have to ask them. I would add that what am I and who am I are not abstract philosophical questions. They inevitably lead us to ask, how ought I behave in the world? And how ought I treat other human beings? So even in this moment of crisis upon crisis, these questions matter. My argument is simple. When pressed by technology, science, philosophy, politics, or the simple fact of difference, to think about what it means to be human, religious notions that are embedded in our cultural imaginations will surface, and they shape our common life. Given our context in North America, Christian teachings are overly determinative in ways that go unexamined or underexamined. And a commitment to pluralism requires that we recognize a broader diversity of convictions about what and who we are. So I'm not trying to demonstrate that religious ideas matter or have something to contribute to thinking about what it means to be human. I think it's obvious that they do. And I don't mean simply that religious ideas of the human shape how we think about each other or how we treat each other in the grocery store. I mean that they shape public policy and social norms, even with our putative separation of religion and state. Questions of theological anthropology figure prominently in our culture wars: gender, sexuality, abortion, race. So given that ideas about the human are so fundamental to how we see ourselves, it's easy to mistake our perspective for a universal truth and try to enact it into law. Religious freedom, however, isn't simply a promise that people can worship as they want, and it should not be weaponized as freedom to discriminate, its tragic purpose in numerous recent court cases. True freedom means that one community's religious convictions cannot determine the social or legal norm for us all. But establishing such freedom requires that we first excavate the religious ideas that are embedded in our cultural imaginations. And this is the work I want to do with you. So deepening our commitment to religious pluralism might seem obvious to anyone listening to the ICJS Silber-Obrecht Lecture, but it is not a message that's trending. I'm recording this lecture a couple weeks after President Trump issued the Eradicating Anti-Christian Bias executive order, an order that portrays the disestablishment of Christian values as discrimination. Multiple presidential appointees and members of Congress proudly identify now as Christian nationalists, and 50% of the country says that US policy should be based on Christian values. So I would like to share some of what Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have to say about what it means to be human, and investigate how these teachings show up in the world. Other spiritual life stances have equally compelling teachings, of course, but time is limited, and these are the three I know something about. I'll start with scriptural sources and their interpretations for several reasons. First, they're seen by peoples of the book as the basis for much of religious life, providing an extensive record of how particular beliefs and practices were to be understood and embodied. Proper actions have always depended on how we interpret these texts, which is why we argue so vociferously about what they come to teach. A review of scriptural exegesis also reveals broader possibilities of meaning that have been obscured through the sifting of history and processes of normalization. No teaching has always meant what we think it means. Besides, my doctoral training is in exegesis. I'm that person with a hammer who always sees a nail. Now, admittedly, lived religion has never been identical with the written record, which tends to privilege the perspective of literate intellectual elites, primarily men who studied and taught these texts. Nevertheless, the sources do represent crucial aspects of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So those of us who claim these texts as sacred scripture, we turn them over, and we find everything about us buried within, big questions about our existence. So we'll talk about three of them. Are we good? This is the one we'll discuss today. Are we free? And are we more than dust, more than the flesh and blood that decompose in the earth? Now, bear in mind, though, I'm not a comparative theologian. I teach interreligious studies. I'm interested in diverse ideas about humanity in order to investigate how those differences impact our common life. This is the crucial distinction of interreligious studies. We study encounters, historical and contemporary, intentional and unintentional, embodied and imagined, congenial and conflictual, of individuals and communities who orient around religion differently. So after we explore whether or not we're good, we'll investigate the possible impact of these ideas on our criminal justice system. We'll take up the other two questions in the second lecture and explore how those religious ideas shape the public square. At the end, I will offer a few thoughts about how we might better navigate religious difference in our public discourse and our body politic. Of course, for every answer we find, we'll discover a whole new set of questions. But that's, I think, the thrill of learning. The stories told of our creation in the scriptures and the meanings that have been drawn from them are the fundament of what the traditions have to say about human beings. So this is where we begin. There are two stories of creation of humans in the Hebrew Bible, as you know. I prefer the narrative of Genesis 1, attributed to the priestly authors. Male and female are created simultaneously in the image of God. And like birds and fish, they are charged to be fruitful and multiply, and all creatures are vegetarian. Now, we recognize that its account of God telling humans to fill the earth and master it, giving them dominion over all other living creatures, is problematic. We've taken that charge way too much to heart, as if all of creation exists only for our benefit. Still, the image of God, that concept becomes very important within Judaism and Christianity, as a signifier of what distinguishes our creation as human beings. But Genesis doesn't explain what it means. So, of course, we have countless interpretations offered over the centuries. They generally boil down to three categories, though: substantive, functional, or relational. So let me flesh that out a bit. Substantive, there could be something special about what we are, our form, our intellect, or a soul. Or functional, it might be our purpose in creation that's unique, a vocation, assigned responsibility for the created world, to emulate the divine in what we do, or to serve as co-creators in translating the script of the divine playwright into a living performance. Or relational, it could be our capacity to recognize and relate to the divine, the transcendent, what Christian theologian Karl Rahner described as an intrinsic disposition of the human mind toward the infinite. While there's little agreement about what image of God means, there is more consensus about one of its primary consequences: human dignity. We learn that all human life is valuable and worthy of respect and self-respect. Rabbi Akiba, a Jewish sage from the 1st and 2nd century CE, he used to say, "Humanity is beloved in that we were created in the image of God. It is a mark of superabundant love that it was made known to us that we're created in the image of God." Today, living amidst the AI revolution, I think the self-perception takes on a new urgency. What is it that distinguishes us from, say, artificial intelligence? Does AI somehow cheapen human life? If it acquires sentience, self-consciousness, agency, what then? How should they be treated? Will they also develop an intrinsic disposition toward the infinite? And how are we, in the development of AI, now emulating the divine instinct to create in our own image? The second story in Genesis, the one commonly identified as a story of Adam and Eve, has also inspired endless amounts of commentary. And it's this tale that has most captured the religious imagination of common folk. We see it in art, in literature, even in politics. Apparently, portraying individual persons and their foibles makes for better drama. By the way, I asked ChatGPT to illustrate the story of Adam and Eve. You'll note the nice European-looking figures dressed in lovely togas and gowns. I have no idea where it gets that kind of information. With any consciousness of genre, we should recognize this story as mythology. There are magic trees and talking snakes. God makes noises walking around in the garden, and there are sword-wielding cherubim that guard the entrance. Yet 56% of Americans believe that Adam and Eve were real people. Now we've learned the more a story is repeated, the more people think it's true, and this one certainly has been repeated a few times. But whether understood as story or history, we can appreciate many of its astute observations about humanity. The idea of a common ancestor teaches we are one species, an essential truth that unfortunately has been denied more than once in our history. The idea that the human, Adam, not a guy named Adam, the human, was created out of the earth, the Adamah, reveals a prescient intuition that of course we're made of the same stuff as the rest of creation. And our given task to till and to tend the earth affirms that we're created for a purpose, one that transcends our own existence. And as evidenced by the characters eating from the tree, even after being warned, we recognize our insatiable desire to know and to discover, even when it can harm us. Made clear from the fact that Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the snake, we see we don't really like taking responsibility for our actions. And we see that we have a profound need for relationship. We read, it is not good for the human to be alone. Ha'adam, the human, names all the other animals but finds no partner until the creation of another human. An ezer kenegdo, a helper over against him, but frequently translated as helpmeet. Who knows what that really is? But we do know that humans are super cooperators. We're super competitive also. But what we've accomplished as a species has been because of our capacity to work together. Quranic accounts of our creation share some details, but not others. And I want to mention two notable differences in the story of the first man and woman eating from the forbidden tree, differences in the portrayal of humanity. First, the text emphasizes that they acted together. It uses a special dual grammatical form to help us see that. And secondly, they repent of their disobedience and plead for God's forgiveness. Now, the former precludes some of the virulent critique of Eve that one finds in biblical exegesis. Women are not more susceptible to sin. The latter establishes the centrality of error and repair in the human experience, and mercy as central to our understanding of the divine. Repentance and forgiveness are significant within Judaism and Christianity as well, but in Qur'an, they're foundational to our creation. Qur'an also has passages that discuss the creation of humanity in general. Again, presenting important differences alongside substantial resonance with the biblical teachings. Qur'an doesn't describe humanity as created in the divine image. It scrupulously avoids suggesting any comparability with God. However, the idea does appear in a hadith, an oral tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And Qur'an details how God breathed the divine ruh, the spirit, into our clay form. And this feels very similar to Genesis 2:7, where God blows the breath of life into the Adam. Surah 32 notes that God has created all things in the best possible way, an idea that resonates with the biblical repetition, and God saw that it was good. Manifold aspects of creation are made subservient to humanity. We are identified in Qur'an as Khalifa, and in the biblical dialectic, as well as Qur'an, this power entails stewardship and ethical responsibility. Qur'an also speaks of humanity accepting al-amana, the trust, an obligation of faith and ethics that the heavens and the earth and the mountains apparently had the good sense to decline. Humans accepted it out of ignorance, not recognizing the enormity of this vocation. Let's turn to the question that got me into this mess. Are we good? The history of exegesis has harvested diverse answers from the seeds of these stories, carefully gleaned over the centuries by hosts of meaning makers. I was completely fascinated by the different perspectives found within and among the three traditions. To state them too starkly and simply, at least at the outset, Judaism asserts that we are each created with a yetzer tov, a good inclination, and yetzer hara, the bad inclination. We choose between them in every moment. Christianity, in Western Christianity, the notion of original sin has predominated since the time of Augustine. Adam and Eve's disobedience, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, transmitted to humanity for all time a sinful nature. We're not sinners because we commit sins. Rather, we sin because we are born sinners. And Islam teaches a very different notion of our original nature. We are born with fitra, an innate disposition to recognize goodness and the oneness of God. Now, you could write a whole book on these teachings, a separate book for each one of the traditions. But I'm going to offer just a few ways in which voices over time have drawn out these ideas. And just for fun, here's how ChatGPT illustrated Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, and original sin, and fitra. Discuss amongst yourselves. The rabbinic sages of late antiquity read Torah very closely. Embraced as a perfect text revealed from on high, every word, every letter was understood to bear significance. Rabbi Nachman, son of Rabbi Chisda, for example, noted that the Hebrew word vayitzer, and God formed the human out of the dust of the earth, in Genesis 2:7, it has an extra letter, 2 yuds instead of 1. So he connected the rabbinic notion that we have these competing inclinations to the text of our creation. God formed us, vayitzer, with 2 yetzers, a yetzer tov and a yetzer hara. Now, of course, there are a handful of alternative explanations for the double yud that follow his, all preserved for different things we might glean from them. These interpretations are recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, a massive compilation of teachings collected over the first 5 to 6 centuries of the Common Era, and found elsewhere in the Talmud as a remarkable story in which the rabbis imagine capturing the Yetzer Hara. He warns them that if they kill him, the world will come to an end. So prudently, they lock him up instead. And they discover, to their dismay, that hens stop laying eggs. They have to let him go. We apparently need the Yetzer Hara. A midrash from around the same time goes further. When God announced about creation that it was good, it alluded also, they said, to our good inclination. And when God announced it was very good, it alluded to our evil, our bad inclination. How could that be? Because the Yetzer Hara is the seat of our instinct for survival, for procreation, for building and striving and expanding our reach. We really need it. So it's not like the classic cartoon where you have an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, and each is trying to influence your decision. It's more like your superego and your id. Ultimately, it's up to us to direct them, all our inclinations, to the service of the Most High. Now, Jewish teachings don't identify the story of Adam and Eve as a fall. They simply made a bad decision. In the whole story, the word sin never shows up. Besides, rabbinic thought associates sin with missing the mark. Not a fundamental brokenness, not an ontological evil. It's simply an acknowledgement that we make bad choices sometimes. Some of our instincts and drives can lead us astray. The story of humanity in the garden illustrates how our choices may alienate us from one another, from God, from the natural world, but there is no original sin in Jewish understanding, and humanity doesn't need to be saved. Instead, Torah and the rest of Hebrew Bible invite us to repent, to reconcile, to make better choices. Although it doesn't relate to our 2 competing inclinations, I want to share another explication of the garden narrative that suggests something about what it means to be human. Maimonides, a 12th century rabbi, philosopher, and physician, wondered why God wouldn't want human beings to enjoy the fruits of the tree of knowledge of good and bad. Wouldn't it be of benefit, providing the necessary understanding to make moral choices? He suggested that what we had before eating from this tree was a superior knowledge of truth and falsity. You don't argue that the earth as a sphere is good and the earth is flat is bad, he explained. Rather, the former is true and the latter is false. And imagine we had that for everything. For many of our most important ideas, however, all we have after violating the divine command is a relative judgment, uncertainly grounded in personal feelings about right and wrong, contingent upon culture and context. Now, I don't know whether Maimonides thought about this as storytelling or an actual historical loss, but the insight's kind of profound. In this era of fake news and truthiness, with people consuming information from different sources based on their politics, the gap between what we know and what we believe and our inability to always know the difference seems larger than ever. Early Christian conceptions of the human emerged through countless debates with religious others and within their own community. For example, Gnostics claimed that only spiritual dimensions of existence were good, and the material world was created by a lesser divinity who was prone to cruelty and jealousy. If the creator God is all good and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? This question of theodicy haunts all three traditions, and Christian ideas of the fall offer one explanation. Human disobedience disrupted the original harmony of creation, a cosmos that was indeed created very good. In spreading the young faith, Christian leaders also sought to explain how it is all of humanity needs God's grace as manifest through Jesus as Christ. Building on the apparently extraneous language of Genesis 1, that we are created in the image and in the likeness of God, 2nd century Bishop Irenaeus argued that likeness is carried in the human spirit, and that's what was lost after the fall. Now born only body and soul, we retain just the divine image. But the spirit can be restored for those who believe in Jesus, who thereby receive divine influence and know divine truth. It was Augustine who effectively propagated the concept of original sin, where rabbinic interpretations viewed the mention of image and likeness. In the list of Adam's descendants, it shows up in Genesis 5. The rabbis thought that transmitted our original nature. Augustine understood it to be of a different order. In The City of God, he wrote, "Man reproduced what man became, not when he was being created, but when he was sinning and being punished." That was the image we reproduced. Now, it wasn't unanimous. Pelagius and those who followed him were among early Christian voices who contested the notion of original sin. They argued for the inviolable character of human freedom even after the fall. Augustine countered, well, we do have free will, but it's as if the scales are weighted against us by sin, and only the grace of God helps us to be good. If people could avoid sin through their own efforts, what need would there be for Christ? Pelagianism was ruled heretical, and original sin was affirmed as Orthodox dogma. At the Council of Orange in 529, for example, it was written, "If anyone asserts that Adam's sin affected him alone and not his descendants also, or at least if they declare that it is only the death of the body which is the punishment for sin, and not also that sin, which is the death of the soul, passed through one man to the whole human race, they do injustice to God and contradict the apostle, who says in Romans 5:12, therefore as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned." The passage from Romans continues, identifying Jesus then as the one man whose righteousness leads to justification and life for all. So we see the capacity of human beings to do wrong writ large across the course of human history and embodied in every single person we know. In 1908, G.K. Chesterton quipped, certain new theologians dispute original sin, which is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved. We apparently are the proof. Yet, for many modern Christians, a rigid understanding of original sin is problematic. If we're born sinners, how can God hold us morally accountable? It's also fatalistic, they argue, promoting political quietism and the status quo. Why work against injustice? and it is itself unjust, a species held eternally responsible for the actions of a long ago ancestor. Danielle Schroyer suggests that we instead speak of original blessing, held steadfastly in relationship with God, no matter what. Kierkegaard, Tillich, Niebuhr, and others have tried to reclaim the doctrine without asserting a primordial act of disobedience by the first humans. It's simply human nature. Now, this approach satisfies concerns about mistaking mythology for history, and it preserves God's moral integrity in that no one is being punished for the sin of our ancestors. Yet it forfeits the conviction that the need for salvation precedes any commission of sin. So Ian McFarland argues that it's better to reclaim the doctrine by recognizing that the fall disordered our desires, no matter how we exercise our will, and only God's salvation can reorient them properly. So we can do good, but we need salvation to be good. Very different than the original goodness of fitra. Islamic thought roots the conception of fitra in Surah 30. Set your face firmly toward the religion as a pure, natural believer, Allah's natural constitution, fitra, according to which he constituted, fatra, humanity. There is no changing Allah's creation. And there's an authenticated hadith that mentions fitra as well. The messenger of God, may God bless him and grant him peace, said, "There's not a child born except upon the fitra. Then his parents make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Zoroastrian. This is just as one animal is brought forth from another unbranded. Have you ever seen an animal born branded until you brand it yourselves?" Now, the hadith has shaped interpretations of the verse in two significant ways. First, it directed the emphasis toward our religious nature, a theological fitra, if you will. Secondly, it suggested that all the named parental influences, Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, are leading the child away from the fitra. According to Camilla Adang, the majority of Muslim thinkers came to equate fitra with Islam, and hence to believe that everyone starts their life as a Muslim. The 13th century jurist and Quranic commentator Al-Qurtubi helps to complicate this a bit. He pointed out that Islam, submission, and Iman, faith, those are declared with the tongue, embraced with the heart, performed with the limbs. So the fitra mentioned in the verse can't be Islam in its particular sense. We're not born doing those things. And in the next generation, Ibn Taymiyyah clarified that fitra is the religion of Islam in potentiality. He compared it to a newborn's instinct for its mother's milk. It will suckle if nothing interferes. Similarly, the human fitra is an innate faculty and body of knowledge that, unimpeded by countervailing forces, will actualize knowledge, love, and worship of God. We are born Muslim with a lowercase m, ready to surrender to the divine. Now, Qur'an attests to this conviction in Surah 7, describing a universal primordial covenant. God collects all the souls ever to be born and asks, "Am I not your Lord?" Yes, we bear witness. Now, we don't remember this experience, but it's understood to have left an indelible imprint on our souls. Now, some interpreters believe that the fitra also extends to our epistemological and our ethical capacities. Al-Ghazali claimed that the fitra includes a body of knowledge that leads to other knowledge. We are born as learners, a framework of understanding and intellectual curiosity that leads us tirelessly toward truth. Many Islamic scholars grappled with the same quandary that perplexed Maimonides, namely the distinction between relative moral judgments, even if widely held, and knowledge of truth. Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali ultimately excluded moral judgments from the fitra. We don't know right and wrong on our own, they argued. That's why we need divine revelation. Ibn Taymiyyah, however, understood fitra in more expansive terms, including the moral sphere, with a predisposition to recognize the validity of arguments, to sense the reality of things. Fitra can also undergird ethics. He said, souls are naturally disposed to love justice and its supporters, and to hate injustice and its supporters. This love, which is in the fitra, is what is meant for justice to be good. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all sweetness and light, incapable of doing wrong or justifying evil. Just as Christianity's notion of original sin doesn't mean we can never do anything good. We have drives that can draw us away from our fitra. And just as the angels warned, and God did not disagree, humans can be destructive, greedy, and violent. But it's interesting to consider how instincts for goodness are also a part of human nature. Studies have shown that 5-month-olds demonstrate a preference for good behavior. 1-year-olds will try to soothe someone who's in distress. And the fundaments of conscience start to build in early childhood. We seek love, we love beauty. These behaviors are part of our factory settings. We're hardwired to learn goodness the way we're wired to learn language. So I've laid out the differences at a very basic level. Of course, the more you examine the multitude of voices over the centuries, the more variance you'll find within, and the more similarities you will find between the traditions. But we must turn to the implications for interreligious engagement. How do these concepts show up in our common life? There's a very interesting thesis that emphasis on original sin, particularly within Protestantism, has shaped a spirit of punishment in the United States. Richard Snyder maintains that popular Christian misunderstandings of human nature and divine grace and the outsized influence of Christianity contribute to our plague of mass incarceration and retributive justice. Those who act on their sinful nature are reaping the just deserts of their unredeemed state. Grace and salvation are viewed in individual, non-historical terms, exempting the rest of us from complicity in systems of oppression and injustice that contribute to crime. And by dividing the world into the saved and the damned, we reinforce the divide between us and them that makes it so easy to lock human beings away. Creation grace, the goodness that's embedded in creation and in every human being created in the image of God, gets obscured. Now, trying to craft an argument parallel to Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Snyder doesn't claim that the theology of original sin produces the spirit of punishment. Rather, it contributes in substantive ways and provides moral justification, influencing even those who don't believe in or think about Christian conceptions of sin. It's in the air. Snyder distinguishes between 3 primary modes in which the church has historically influenced the larger society: through force, overt ideology, and inspiriting. Even after the disestablishment of religion, Christian hegemony remains in what we routinely call the West. To speak of hegemony, Snyder asserts, is to recognize the holistic nature of the mechanisms of domination, including the unintentional, the indirect, and the covert. Of these less direct mechanisms of control, religious practices have emerged as extremely important, end quote. Now, I agree with his analysis of the ways religion shapes our common life. But the specific conclusions about criminal justice are not totally persuasive. Unfortunately, he oversimplifies Christian perspectives of sin. He doesn't explain why a more religious era before the 1960s drove a century of liberalizing criminal justice reform. And he doesn't compare the justice system in America to that of nations shaped by different religious conceptions of human nature, a comparison that wouldn't necessarily support the thesis. There is another study, a comparison of European and American law by Joshua Kleinfeld, that might. For most of its history, criminal punishment in the United States was milder than punishment in continental Europe, and therefore it was thought more humane. It was connected to a political conviction, a standard tenet of the Enlightenment belief, that said democracy requires penal moderation because rights-bearing citizens won't tolerate abusive treatment. Yet, a crime wave in the mid-20th century America brought an even more deep-seated set of cultural values to the fore. It radically reversed the relative harshness in US versus European criminal justice, and it produced differing conceptions of crime. Kleinfeld writes that American punishment pictures serious offenders as morally deformed people, rather than ordinary people who've committed crimes. Their criminality is thus both immutable and devaluing, a feature of the actor rather than merely the act. This sounds quite a bit like the theological conviction that we aren't sinners because we sin, but rather we sin because we are sinners. People commit crimes because they're criminals. Now, is this an instance of my hypothesis that when pressed by external developments, in this case, the US crime wave, religious notions about what it means to be human that are embedded in our cultural imaginations will surface and shape our common life? It is perhaps buttressed by another observation Kleinfeld makes. In the late 20th century, the German Lutheran Church had a prominent role in reforming Germany's criminal justice system so that it emphasized rehabilitation. Although in many ways this is at odds with the tradition of German Lutheranism, he speculates that after World War II, Germany most of all needed to believe in the mutability of evil. Now, we should note the distinction between the inspiriting influence of the previous examples and the overt institutional influence of this one. There's another distinction, however, that further complicates our thinking about how religious ideas of the human influence the body politic, because we see how Christian convictions are undergirding two very different directions for criminal justice. It's not that one is misreading the tradition and the other is not, but rather a range of factors shape how we interpret our multivocal, dynamic traditions. So before we move on to our other questions about human nature, let's conclude this first lecture with a brief consideration of what Terence Keel calls mongrel epistemology. We can't identify all the sources of how we come to know or think something, each source itself being an amalgam of influences, and we certainly can't tease them apart. Religious, political, economic convictions, gender, race, age, nationality, social class, life experience, and the historical moment, these all shape our everyday theology. Many scholars, for example, assert that Americans' religious commitments increasingly shape their political ones. We've seen plenty of evidence for this in recent election cycles. Yet there are also studies that demonstrate the causal relationship is often reversed. Partisan identities determine how people engage with religion, what they believe, how they read scripture, what kind of community they might join. What can we say then about how religious ideas of the human affect our common life? When we get to the second question and we talk about body and soul, I think the connections are more evident. I'll argue that religious conceptions of the human have a profound impact on public policy regarding abortion and public attitudes regarding embodiment, particularly sexuality. Still, I can't prove that religion is the prime cause. When we get to free will, we'll see that there is a rich religious exploration of its possibilities and limitations, and we'll recognize the profound discomfort many people feel when scientific research suggests there is no such thing as free will. But it's unlikely that religious teachings form the core of our resistance. The very idea that religion is a separable part of our worldview that can objectively be examined is suspect. But religion is in the mix. It always has been. Until our national experiment with separating religion and state, it was never imagined that you could remove particularistic religious values from affairs of state. Now, some political forces are trying to officially reinstate them. I'm hoping most of you share my profound objection to that goal. I'm hoping you share my commitment to pluralism and honoring the diversity of our theological anthropologies. As I stated at the outset, the first step is to excavate the religious ideas that are embedded in our cultural imaginations, ideas that justify laws and social norms impacting our common life. So we will just keep digging.